So we've seen images of gang members being exported to El Salvador. This we have seen the U.S. do in the past. I seem to recall that right after 9/11, we set up stuff that was down in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, and we were exporting people down there, and they were held for some indefinite periods of time. Feels like we might be doing something similar again within the Trump administration. Lucas, I know you're kind of tracking this carefully. Is this new? Like, what's maybe disturbing about what's been happening with some gang members being shipped down to El Salvador?
Well, first of all, there's a presumption that they're gang members. Just because they're from Venezuela doesn't necessarily mean that they are a part of Tren de Aragua. I always want to say Agua, but the gang that made so many headlines the uh, in the election last year. In Especially in Denver, I think in Utah, Chicago. I was very wary of the narrative of this gang and the gang violence that was coming from it that the Republicans were putting out. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but it seemed to be exacerbated because it fit the narrative of concerns that the United States had with regards to immigration. So one, I just want to point out that those who've been flown into El Salvador, the Venezuelan supposed members of Tren de Aragua, um, are were accused of being gang members. They haven't gone to trial, and no, they're not United States citizens. So I think part of the question that we have to ask ourselves here are, what are our expectations of due process for citizens of the United States? What are they for residents of the United States? What are they for illegal aliens who are residing in the United States? Because there are three different thresholds there, and we need to be wary about what sort of precedent that we're setting for citizens of the United States. Now, secondly, I am more concerned when some of these. Yeah, here we have, by the way, one of the Venezuelans who was flown into El Salvador, who says that he was a barber and he checked into an immigrant registration facility, an ICE facility in Dallas, and he was taken to a federal detention center, and then from that federal detention center flown not to Venezuela but to El Salvador. So there we have some more sticky issues because whenever we start exporting our problems to places where we're not looking, then we can forget about things that we might put a stop to or have a civil discussion about if they're occurring on our homeland in front of our faces.
Right, because if we send people to El Salvador, it makes it a lot harder for what organizations like the ACLU to come in and audit and provide feedback and say these people shouldn't be here and to fight or to try to help people who've been swept up in this kind of stuff and government made a mistake.
Yeah, and at what point do we go from this? I mean, you mentioned 9/11 and the extraordinary rendition of citizens from other nations around the world that were taken to Cuba and put on a military base there, hidden from the American eyes. And we found out in time that many of them had merely been accused, and and the United States government had no proof that they were engaged in terrorism, and yet they got drug into a prison and were kept there for at least 20 years. And the detainees that exist in Guantanamo today, because they still exist there today, nobody thinks about them, nobody talks about them, and they've never gone to trial. So if the United States is about justice and about due process, then this is an issue. And whenever we start incarcerating people on our rules in other locations, then we are setting up a system in which we can forget about them, or we can entrust other people. The president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, an interesting person in this regard. Um, so I think this is a problem, and Americans should be worried about it. At what point do we make the jump from Venezuelan supposed gang members to American gang members? Is we I don't.
It doesn't seem like it's that big of a leap, especially if, we're sending people from different countries to El Salvador. It seems really strange that we would send, you know, gang members from Venezuela and then send them to El Salvador if they've committed crimes in America. Like, is the justification for that is that they can't be sent back to Venezuela? I didn't hear anything from the administration about like why they would seek to send Venezuelans to El Salvador, and we don't have any evidence yet that that this has been happening, except for maybe errantly to people who uh, would have been sent here. Is this like a particular initiative that's happening with the gang that they're trying to rid out, or whatever is happening here?
Well, this is why I get very nervous about this supposed narrative about Tren de Aragua. Ar- I'm just going to say TDA. Um, the reason that I've been so wary about it is because of the diplomatic relationship that the United States has with Venezuela. Um, and that story also gets deeper. But I mean, just to back us up a couple of months, the United States State Department sponsored a color revolution and has done so repeatedly. I mean, when Hugo Chavez was in power in Venezuela, he was an enemy of the Bush administration. He was an enemy of the war in Iraq. His successor, his handpicked successor, um, the bus driver. I can't remember his name. The United States has tried to coup him recently with Juan Guaido. There was a lady that they tried to foist into the elections. So when the United States is tampering with other countries' elections, then we need to be very wary about what storylines are being pitched to us here in the United States and what's actually going on there. So that to me makes any diplomatic or relationship with Venezuela and with Venezuela citizens, refugees, whatever we may call them, sort of problematic. So that those were things that happened just in this last year. The other reason that I thought that the United States might have more interest in Venezuela than just our concern for humanitarian values and democratic values around the world would be because the massive amount of oil reserves that Venezuela has. And I believe Chevron supposedly has the rights to those. The other thing that gets interesting about Venezuela is their ties with the voting machines that have been accused of being manipulatable and manipulated to sway elections here in the United States. Because now I can't remember the name of the voting machine company, but it's based out of the ownership is Venezuelan. So these all make questions about why those in political power might have an interest in um, in getting rid of Venezuelan citizens or stirring up passions and views about what's going on with Venezuelan immigrants or gang members and crime. Um, this is all what's going on in a broader context. Recently too, the United States, by the way, confiscated the Venezuelan Maduro, by the way, Nicolas Maduro confiscated Maduro's jet. He flew his presidential plane. He flew into Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi Arabians allowed the United States to come in and seize and take over his presidential jet, and we did so on the auspice that he owed the United States money. So it doesn't sound like sovereignty to me. And so again, um, you know, I also find it interesting that we have this relationship with the president of El Salvador, and that president of El Salvador came to power in El Salvador from locking up MS-13 gang members who the United States who were El Salvadorans and Guatemalans who had come to especially Los Angeles in the early 2000s, maybe in the late 90s, and had joined gangs. And so these gangs were the product of American violence and American crime. And rather than deal with this situation that we had allowed to occur in the United States, we exported them back to El Salvador, and we sent a massive number of violent criminals to El Salvador, where they then took over the country until Nayib Bukele came to power, used the military and um, a draconian sort of prison regime and incarceration regime that stirred concerns about due process there. But he said, "Well, we've got to take care of it, and we'll try to sort this out later. But we've got a massive crime problem on our hands."
And I think to some extent he's been successful in this because he rounded up a lot of criminals, and as far as some of the reports that I saw, that violent crime and crime in El Salvador reduced dramatically. And if I recall correctly, this was something that New York also tried and had some success with. I'm not necessarily saying that there aren't human rights violations and all this what's been happening here, but I think part of the reason that this jail even exists is because they were pursuing this policy, and they said, "What, we overbuilt it, so we could take some prisoners from the US if you need it. We've got this mega prison." Is that sort of the situation we're looking at?
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly what we're looking at. But when we look at the prison system in the United States, and it certainly worked to some degree here in the United States to lock up prisoners, but um, when we begin to look at what has occurred there, what number of those prisoners were one arrested because of drug related crimes, and look at or nonviolent drug offenses, then thrown into a prison with violent offenders. You know, have we solved the situation, or have we made it worse? I'm not sure what the answer is there, but I again, I really begin to worry whenever we start making this more complex by relying on foreign countries. And when I think also of the United States, uh, the abuse of the United States sort of soft power of the dollar, and what it might mean for us to set up a relationship with another country where we send them prisoners and they hold those prisoners and we send them money. And then I look at the private prison system and what goes wrong in the private prison system in the United States. I say, wow, this is a big step in the wrong direction. If we're going to have public incarceration, then that should be a uh, a public bureaucracy and something that's held as closely to the eye of I don't know, elections and the sunshine that we expect in a public government.
Are you recording already?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting situation that's developing. So when we're thinking about what might be going on with this particular situation, Lucas, are we really focused on the human rights violations that would occur from this, or like are you thinking more along the constitutional lines? Because it seems like it's problematic on both fronts in my mind, and I'm definitely recalling the situation where we're we're running into this with Guantanamo, and I just feel like we're back right in that same narrative, and we never really resolved it last time around. I feel like there was a lot of constitutional outcry to what was happening, and I feel like now if this is being championed by the right, is this the gonna set up a political battle between what's going on with the big crowds that AOC and Bernie are amassing with fight the oligarchy? Is this going to be one of the points that they use to attack the Trump administration?
Well, on one level, and like on a broad and maybe the most concerning, but also like the um, a long fight that we must always be fighting. One that we should. I I don't mean to, be histrionic about the human rights violations. They are there. I'm not saying that what El Salvador is doing is wrong or they're harming human rights. I find the steps that Nayib Bukele. I'm very impressed with some of the steps he's taken, but I'm also very wary again because of the diplomatic relationships with Venezuela, the focus on Venezuela, but more so, what I see as cause for concern here is the political tension and what's going on between the Republicans and the Democrats. You know, the Republicans have been very uh, immigration was at the top of their sort of concern list in the last election, even more so than uh, wars that the United States is engaged in around the world, or the problems that we have with the national debt and problems at the financial and monetary heart of the federal government. Rather than addressing and discussing those, the discussion was over immigration, and this gets um, to
Because
how.
part of this narrative is that there's this flood of immigrants that are being brought into the country. They're all voting Democrat, and so this is an attempt to try to ch- l- attack the roots of the power base of the Democrats. I feel like there's some narrative that I've heard in there repeatedly that this is, what the the whole immigration policy is really about, like flooding certain areas with votes that the Democrats can collect up, but and that's why we don't have the voter ID laws. I feel like this is a talking point to whip the right up into a frenzy. But are criminals really voting in elections? It seems dubious to me that would be a strong motivator for the M13 members or whatever to go out and cast a vote in an election.
I um I say that we should
I
maybe.
could be wrong on that, but it just seems to me it's like maybe that it's more of a way to rally your base rather than a reflection on reality. But I guess I'd have to really look at the numbers if there was anybody that's seriously looked into this.
Well, think about say New York politics in the what 1880s through the Gilded Age. Look at Tammany Hall. Those were immigrants. Um, those were directly tied to uh, political pork. Um, uh, it would be nothing new if that was occurring. And not only that, whenever we look at the Democratic policies of obfuscating or removing any voter ID and easing the access to polls to the point of not requiring any identification. I think there are maybe more efficient ways of election fraud. And we should also pay attention in the lead up to the midterms and the upcoming presidential election. Democrats are already beginning to pivot and to say, well, there was no voter fraud. It wasn't individual people, but there's definitely been election fraud. And it was actually the Republicans who were behind the election fraud. So I also say that it's it is it is a it's not just getting immigrants in to vote, but it's also getting immigrants in to raise the population of certain areas, because this is why the Republicans and the Democrats had a fight about the question in the last census as to whether you were a citizen or not. And there was a big fight over that. The Republicans wanted it to be included in the census as to whether there was a citizen or not, because the apportionment of federal monies is according to the populations. So um, I do think there is, especially whenever you get into the calculations of the Democrats and the Republicans, there's a lot at heart here with what the immigration policy should be. And um, uh, this is why the Trump administration also has turned. And I mean, I don't know if you saw that the Trump administration has removed the temporary protected status or the parole of 530,000 immigrants into the United States, but they've recently done so and said we're putting you on a timeline for getting you out of the country. Um, and That's a lot of voters. So, or that's a lot that's a lot of people who could be voting, especially when there's no identification at the polls. But if it's not a lot of voters, it's also a lot of jobs. It's a lot of homes. It's a lot of money that could ostensibly be saved from the social safety net support that some of these asylum seekers and immigrants and aliens are getting from the government here in the United States. So I and I should also add on top of that, because some people are going to say, "Well, you don't like immigration." I like immigration. I define libertarian as being about open borders, but I think that the United States has a problem with where money comes from and how we generate money, and it's an easier political decision to restrict the people who have access to those benefits rather than having a discussion about where money comes from. And so the Republicans are this is the forefront of their issues. Again, before solving the debt issue or the creation of money in the United States, before addressing our foreign wars. Trump talked a big game about Russia and about Gaza and Israel, but he's been unable to close out the war with Russia. He's been unable to, and has exacerbated, as it seems, the war in the Middle East, especially now that the United States is bombing Yemen and threatening Iran. So, um, uh, the Republicans have put this at the top of their list. They are deporting people left and right, and they talked again in the elections. They talked about criminals this and criminals that, but as we saw with the article about the Venezuelan who was taken to El Salvador, he was a barber living in Texas who checked in voluntarily to an ICE registration center and was deported. So I think that if we start digging in, we're going to find a lot more of those kind of stories going on, and the concentration will be on the number of violent criminals that are being deported. But whenever we're talking about 530,000 people, I find it hard to believe that those are all hardened criminals and drug dealers here in the United States.
Yeah, invariably mistakes will be made and people will get swept up into something for which it was very inappropriate for them to have been deported. I have no doubt. Like it's not necessarily that the government gets things right or accurately in any way, even if they had the best of intentions.
I glanced at this article for an aside. You see the Clinton family and the Schuyler family. That's the Clinton family in the old New York family. I wonder if George Clinton is related to them. But the Schuylers would become the Roosevelts. Um, Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR were what, fifth cousins, and Eleanor was the niece of Teddy Roosevelt. So just it's interesting to see that name pop up on our screen. They had a lot of problems with immigration then too, and we should think about some of what was going on at that time. The United States was engaged in um, opium trade in the Far East. That was where a lot of money for New England traders was coming in from, and not least Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His mother was Sarah Delano, and Sarah Delano grew up in Hong Kong. Her father was an opium trader, and would lead to the Boxer Rebellion and the political catastrophe that occurred there. So, um, and we also had the Chinese exclusion policy at the time, which I don't know. It's just interesting to think about the relationships with American trade and immigration policy and how those seem to repeat themselves as the United States was interested in selling opium, but uh, not having Chinese immigration at the time that it had trade with China, and now we want to take Venezuelan or buy Venezuelan oil, quote unquote, buy Venezuelan oil, but we don't want Venezuelan immigrants here.
Yeah, so
So
we've got a long history in this country of like repeated behavior, things that keep cropping up, keep happening over and over again. That it kind of feels that way here. Like maybe this is not that new if you look at the broader scope of how U.S. history has actually gone.
yeah, there's also it's as we think about the distinction between citizens, residents, and illegal aliens or aliens. It's also interesting to see that the Trump administration has already talked about um, removing surrogacy or anchor babies, whatever you want to call it. But in one part, they talk about r- moving to and relying on birthright citizenship, but also denying that if both the parents are not citizens. So, and when I think about what might be the best solution, this is also where I think we're going to have to grapple with, you know, does just being born in an area give you an entitlement to the especially the social safety net and the payments that come from that?
I mean,
Um,
doesn't it kind of have to? That's what it means to immigrate to a country is that like children would gain the full rights of like moving there. I mean, I guess it's not necessarily if you're under here as a criminal or under false pretenses, but I got to imagine that like birthright citizenships is one of the foundations of like how what it even means to be a part of a country is you were born there and you have a stake in the game. I mean, shouldn't it be?
well,
What else
I
would be the dividing line? You'd have to make sure you're a full citizen before citizenship would be granted upon heirs and progeny?
well, I think it should be whether you pay taxes. And how long have you been paying taxes? And I think also about some of the changes that are being made in Argentina. They're moving the taxing of this of the taxing authorities over to the electric bill. So the municipality is collecting taxes as they send out the taxes to fund the government, local government, as they send out the electric bill. Now, and then if we think about these better technologies that we have in databases and tracking things, then I say, why are we not entertaining solutions that say, how long have you paid taxes? How long have you paid property and land tax in a specific area? What sort of voting does paying those taxes or living in a certain area, what sort of possibilities open up? And I know we have a history of poll taxes, but I'm thinking of something altogether different, and not a poll tax that says, you have to pay $5 in order to get a ballot, but saying, have you paid your property taxes? Why do we let somebody
Or if
who's
you
born in
so
the United
if
States?
you've made like a $500,000 worth of tax contributions, then you earn one child citizenship right token, something like that.
I mean, it could be, but at the very least, it doesn't have to, I would say, like, why do we not include in this discussion saying, "Oh, you were born in the United States, you've had a job here, but you've never paid your income or your property tax. You've at least never paid your income tax. Why should you get to vote?" Why is that not included in our calculation of who deserves to have a say in the political outcomes
Well,
in the United States?
we did have that. That was definitely a part of it. You had to be a landowner. So we used to have some idea that you had to have stake in the game before you could have a vote.
Well,
But
That's the Republican, and we talk so much about Democratic Republic and these aspects of Republic, and I understand not everybody having access to that, but everyone has to pay an income tax ostensibly, or at the very least, we could be saying, do these stakeholders, are they giving back? And if you already have assets and representation in the United States, why is it solely, were you born here or did you file the right paperwork whenever you moved from state to state? Why is that the only consideration that we're making as to who deserves to vote?
I think it's largely been because we did. It's somewhat. I think it's inherent in what it means to be a person who's immigrated. I just can't imagine that like you would have these bars or that you would have these progressive things that you'd unlock over time. I think it was a consequence of how things were set up in the past. But if you're saying could we move to something a little bit more sophisticated, I think it starts to trend into something that looks much more surveillancely than we'd probably want. The only way to effectuate something like that would be to have a much better system of tracking and surveillance than what we've got now. You've got to be able to tie tax records together and then put something together. So I'd say, just my first reaction to that is probably that like technology really didn't exist until maybe the late 90s and then into the 2000s where even something like that could have been possible. So I don't know, the gears turn slowly. I suppose there's not much appetite for proving that you've done something to gain access to the US citizenship, but maybe
Well,
that's
and
what Trump is starting to do with saying pay us a whole bunch of money and you have a stake in the game.
absolutely. I mean, we also have a change with regards to, is a citizenship for sale? And people were shocked to think of uh, of such a devaluation of birthright citizenship, but it's been going on for a long time, since the late 90s. And so we should not try to put the genie back in the bottle, but we should try to make that available for more people. And I know that we're stumbling into, the dreaded words of a CBDC or a social score, but the answer to having social scores is to have multiple avenues for people to pay and to move around the world. I mean, nobody. People once had some of these complaints about our credit scores, but nobody. Everyone says, "Oh, social scoring is a terrible thing," and yet nobody says, "But I paid all my bills on my credit bills and my utility bills, and my interest rate for my house is 2 points lower than um, than the mean for the average citizens." That's a social credit score, and that's giving some people privileged access into the society of America.
And it certainly comes into play even of jobs. I mean, a lot of times credit checks are ran for various positions and you can be denied employment because of your credit score. So it's not that far out to say that we're actually living under this and have been for some time. It's definitely a mechanism to suppress the ability for people who have had economic hardships to ever recover from it. And I think about like the black mark that you get if you ever admit to a felony or plea out. Like that puts you into an entirely different class of society just as a matter of course. So like we've definitely had this tiered structure of how you exist in the United States. First line being whether you've ever committed a felony, and that puts you into the lowest caste of society. And then if you haven't and you're above that, then yeah, your credit score really affects a lot of how your life is going to play out, especially if you need to leverage debt, which most Americans do. They end up financing a car, trying to rent, trying to buy a home. All of these things are influenced by that score. So it certainly is the case that we're somewhat living under this already. And if you try to opt out of that game, it's even harder, not easier.
There's two other things that I think about as we think about, what our concepts are for who has a stake in an election. One, I always find it interesting that at one time in America, those people who sat on a school board were the property owners. Whenever the school was funded by the property tax, and the property tax was assessed at the county level, and school districts that existed inside of a county, you go back to the 50s and the 60s, you look at the school board, it's all the largest property owners that existed in the county, or in that taxing district of the school. And now you look at school boards and it's people who have their children in school. And I'm not sure which is there's a problem with the concern of education coming from the property owners who ostensibly want to keep their property tax lower. But then you have a problem of nepotism whenever you start just getting parents who are sitting on the school board, and maybe some short-sighted decisions that are made that also aren't taking into account the cost of school and the return that comes from that. The other thing that I think about is the Democrats have said that they don't want to see any sort of identification or and we could throw into that social credit when it comes into elections because of the unfairness in access. And to that, the Republicans should take the line that, okay, um, those are valid points, those are valid concerns. So what the government should be doing is ensuring that everybody has those. So to ensure that everybody has identification, that there is no cost for that, or the cost is carried or covered by the government, by taxes that are paid in, to open up access to the polls, voter holiday, and talk about some sort of subsidization that could be made to put into a public concern transportation to the polls. A lot of these Republicans complain about Democrats and buses of people that they're getting to the polls. Well, their response should be not to get rid of the buses, but to say, okay, well, we're going to make it a public bus, or we're going to extend the window of time that the polling box is open. I don't know why we do it in one day. And now we have early voting and mail-in voting. Those occur for a longer time period. I don't understand why the response to some of these Democratic concerns is from Republicans is not to say, okay, valid point, we'll make sure that the government covers all of that. To me, those would be a lot more beneficial solutions than a race to the bottom that we've seen in the last 2 or 3 elections.
Interesting stuff to think about. I think we're kind of at the top of the hour, though. Any final thoughts, or is that kind of where we're going to leave it?
No, I've got a lot of my concerns out. Let's be wary of prisons in other countries. I guess that's the last thought I'll leave everybody with.
I hope to see the libertarian arm of the Republican Party step up and say that this is not okay. That's the that's the arm that I hope continuously challenges stuff like this, because our system should be able to handle this. We don't need to engage with foreign prisons. I didn't like it during 9/11 with Guantanamo, and I think we should be equally not liking this as well. So it's kind of my last thought. So we'll keep an eye on it and report it more. Thanks for bringing it up, though, because I hadn't been keeping a close enough eye on this. So I'm really glad that we took a chance to look into this a little bit today.
Well, thanks for humoring my Tammany Hall reference too. So we'll see you tomorrow.
All right, see ya.